Good evening, everyone, and thank you for registering for July's second Thursday lecture, brought to you in partnership with the Louisiana State Museum and the Friends of the Cabildo. Tonight, we feature Dr. Maria Angela Diaz presenting on her new book, A Continuous State of War, Empire Building and Race Making in the Civil War Era Gulf South. My name is Chris Cook. I'm the Director of Education for Louisiana State Museum, and I'm very excited about tonight's lecture. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. First, everyone registered for this presentation will receive a recording tomorrow morning. If you know anyone who was interested and wanted to attend but did not register in time, they can still get a copy of the recording. I would ask that everyone stay muted until we get to the Q&A. Also note, we will have time for a Q&A. So everyone, please stay muted. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please, I'll ask that you type them into the chat. And then when we get to the Q&A portion of tonight's lecture, I'll read through all the questions that came into the chat first to kick off the Q&A. So if you have any questions as they come up, put them in the chat. I'll read those off in pretty much the order that they come in, unless it makes sense to group some together. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to tonight's speaker. Dr. Angela Daiz is a professor at the University of Illinois and previously taught at Utah State University, where her courses covered the American Civil War, military history, Latinx history, and Black history. She received her PhD from the University of Florida. Dr. Diaz's main areas of research include the American South, the Civil War era, the history of the borderlands, the Gulf South, slavery, race, American imperialism, and territorial expansion. The subject of tonight's lecture, A Continuous State of War, is out now with the University of Georgia Press. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to tonight's speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to the museum for having me and to do this talk. So yes, tonight I'm going to be focusing on a particular part of the book, and I just also want to say in advance, I have two cats, and they are currently locked in another room, so if you hear meowing, that's why. But anyway, moving on to the history. So my book is entitled, and here's the title you can see here, A Continuous State of War, Empire Building and Race Making in the Civil War Gulf South. And when I start my book talks, I usually start with origin stories. And basically, first I'm going to tell you a little bit of where this book comes from and what inspired me to write the book in the first place. Aside from just getting my PhD, what inspired me to deal with this subject. So the origins of the subject come from three different aspects of my personality and my own life experience. So one is being Mexican and being a Mexican-American girl in the American South. I was born in Texas, so born and raised, I'm a Texas girl. And I've lived in a lot of different parts of the South. I've lived in North Carolina, Virginia. I did my PhD work, as you heard just now, in Florida. And as I entered into these communities, especially once I got out of Texas, usually the question I got was some form of, what are you? Sometimes that question is very polite. Sometimes it's not as polite as I would have liked it, but there was always this kind of curiosity about my racial makeup, my ethnic background, what exactly that looked like. And so when I went to graduate school, and I sort of was searching around for a subject that actually forms the basis of one aspect of my work, which is, how it is that Southerners, but especially how it is that white Southerners in the 19th century kind of engage with the outside world, especially with Latin America and people of Latin American descent. The second aspect of my personality that kind of shapes this subject is being just an out and out Civil War nerd. Ever since I was a little kid, I remember pulling up this big cushy ottoman we had in our living room and just planting myself on it and watching Ken Burns' Civil War, like all 8 hours for, whenever it came on PBS. And I was just absolutely fascinated with it. And I was, in general, fascinated with history, period. When I, went on a trip to New Orleans, I was absolutely fascinated with this type of history as well. And then also in the Southwest. So, anything having to do with that, but especially around the Civil War, I was just absolutely wrapped and interested in that history. So those two things kind of become married together when I go to graduate school. What is it about Latin America that sort of captures, the interest of white Southerners in the Civil War era, and what are the communities along the Gulf South? What are their experiences during that period? And when it comes to these efforts to take over parts of Latin America in the mid-19th century. And this comes to my fascination with spaces. The way that history engages with community, the way that, history is also shaped by just the structure of geography and geopolitics is something also that I became very interested in as I was getting my PhD. And that all kind of culminates in this book about the Gulf South. So this is a map that is actually on the inside of the book, on the page next to the start of the introduction. It was made for me by a very good friend of mine, and the communities that are highlighted in the map, if you can see, I know it's kind of small, but anyway, these are the communities that I actually focus on quite a bit when I talk about race, war, and empire. So when it does come to this space, I always ask my my audience to think about the space as we're going through the talk. Think about the shape of it and what possibilities that shape holds. I like to think of the Gulf of Mexico as essentially sort of the center, like the hub, right, the middle of the wheel. And as it radiates out, there are all these other different types of history. And different historical narratives that are being told about all of these different spaces, and they all come together in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the Gulf of Mexico becomes a waterway, but it also becomes a way in which cultures, races, ethnicities, nation states, empires all sort of intersect and collide together. And that very much shapes the communities along the American Gulf Coast. The communities that I study specifically are Galveston, New Orleans, Pensacola, but also Mobile, a little bit Havana and Veracruz as well, starting in about the 1830s and then moving all the way through to the end of the Civil War, when I talk about Confederates leaving the South and actually going and founding colonies in places in Latin America like Mexico and Brazil, and some of them do wind up in Cuba as well. So when it comes to sort of these three big words, race, war, and empire, in the Gulf South, and as I state, in the introduction, throughout the Civil War era, the Gulf South was in a continuous state of war. And at the center of Southern empire building and race making, war existed in the far-flung borders of the Gulf of Mexico and affected communities large and small throughout the entire coastal region. From the 1840s to the 1880s, white Southerners in the Gulf South went to war with Native Americans, Mexicans, Cubans, the Spanish, and finally, when Americans went to war with each other, white Northerners and free and enslaved African Americans. And it's that continuous state of war, conflict after conflict after conflict, that really gives shape to how it is that these communities engage with the process of racialization and the process of American Southern empire fantasies. And that's the thing, is that white Southerners, especially of the slaveholding class, in the the 19th century, really were sort of fascinated with and fantasizing about the idea of spreading slavery, not just to Texas, not just to the West, but further south, going ever further south into Mexico, into Cuba, into Central America, even South America, with this idea of spreading this sort of slave-based society further and further and gaining more and more territory. So Southerners, especially those along the Gulf South, whenever they look out at the world, they don't just look west. They look south as well, right? They look in two different directions. And those processes of westward expansion and the sort of fantasy of Southern Empire are very intimately tied together and connected along the Gulf South. And each one of these communities, New Orleans included, is very invested in the buildup of military in the region, both the Army and the Navy, is also very invested in the protection of trade in the region, as well as invested in these, efforts to conquer more territory. And so they both shape that story as well as are shaped by it. They're very much launching pads for this sort of expansionist fantasy and empire that is taking place throughout the Civil War era. So watch that space. So Cuba and the Crescent City. I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that New Orleans, especially in the 19th century, but also even stretching into the 20th century, is very much connected to Latin America, connected to the Caribbean, and connected to Cuba itself. One of the ways that it's connected to Cuba is in the fact that there are Cuban exiles, Narciso Lopez, who creates these things called the filibuster expeditions that we're going to talk about today. He's one of those examples of Cuban exiles that actually move to New Orleans. There's a Cuban exile community there, and then also in New York City. During the mid-19th century. There's also trade that is happening here. And that interest in obtaining Cuba as a potential new slave state, that's something that many of the city's merchants, newspapers are advocating for in the aftermath of the Mexican War. A lot of this interest in taking over Latin American territory becomes a sort of wave after the Mexican War and the success of the Mexican War from the perspective of Americans. The other thing, though, that the Gulf South and those in New Orleans are very interested in, like I said, is the protection of trade. And that's what this quote is here to remind us of, right? Should the enemy, that enemy that they're talking about is actually Europe, especially England and an abolitionist England by the time we get to the 1850s. Yes, a lot of the cotton that's coming out of the American South is going to English factories, but within the Gulf Coast, there is a persistent worry that England will somehow try and take over, that this is a massive naval power that they need to be protected from. And trade coming out of New Orleans needs to be protected. And the way that they think that it can be protected is by obtaining this territory and by taking hold of Cuba, which is basically like right there at the front door. So that's also something that you see in newspapers and by city boosters in all of the other communities in the Gulf South as well, especially the smaller community, which is Pensacola. They have a lot of fortifications and a naval yard there, and they kind of are hoping to be like the big military power for the Americans in the Gulf South. So this is one of those connections that I'm going to be exploring here when we talk about this thing called filibuster expeditions. So first, look at these three guys. First, though, these are all men that are involved in filibustering. And Narciso Lopez is kind of the main character besides these are the three main characters, but Narciso Lopez is like the main dude. So what is filibustering? Some of you may not be aware of what filibustering is, so I'll define it for you. In the 19th century, what we mean by filibustering is armed expeditions, and these are extra-legal or basically illegal armed expeditions to other countries to take over that territory. And there are a number of armed expeditions like this that happen post-Mexican War, but if we look at the Gulf South, the way that the United States obtains some of the territory along the Gulf South is actually through filibustering expeditions. So this is very much a tradition in the region, especially in Florida. One can even argue that aspects of the Texas War of Independence, that it sort of functions like a filibuster expedition. But the expedition that sort of captures everyone's attention after the Mexican War is these filibustering expeditions, two of them, one in 1850 and one in 1851, to Cuba, to take Cuba over. And that interest in Cuba, once again, that stretches back very much to the beginning of the 19th century. Even Thomas Jefferson talked about obtaining Cuba as a part of his big sort of idea of empire, the empire of liberty. So a little bit about our friend here, Narciso Lopez, who's of course this gentleman here. So Lopez, like you can see, was born in 1797. He's actually born in Venezuela. He's born to a merchant family there. So, his family is somewhat well off. He fought in the Independence War, but he actually fought on the side of the Spanish. He had a short stint as a governor of a province in Cuba before his military benefactors were removed from power. Lopez attempted to find his place in Cuban society through various business ventures. And each time he sort of failed at some of these business ventures, his loyalty to Spain, Spain's management of Cuba just becomes more and more and more, his loyalty just becomes weaker and weaker and weaker until he really doesn't have any more loyalty towards Spain's management of Cuba. And Cuba is at this point a Spanish colony. So Lopez eventually joined the annexationists on the island, and there are those on the island who support an independent Cuba. There are also those on the island who support the possibility of Cuba being annexed to the United States, and Lopez joins this group of people. He begins planning, for a Cuban uprising and independence movement there, and its eventual inclusion into the United States. And there's an early attempted armed uprising in 1847, and this causes Lopez to have to flee Cuba. He's almost arrested, but then he leaves for the United States, and he settles among a Cuban immigrant community, first in New York City, where he begins planning an expedition to Cuba to try and start a revolution and start an independence movement. That happened. It starts in so it happens in 1849. There's this early would-be expedition in 1849, and the reason I call it a would-be expedition is because it doesn't get any farther south than just off the coast of Mississippi. There's an island called Round Island, and this is known as the Round Island Affair in 1849. So after this aborted attempt, we see Lopez then eventually make his way into New Orleans, where he begins planning this next expedition, which is the first official expedition that actually makes landfall in Cuba. And he begins to recruit men to New Orleans, and many of the men that he recruits actually wind up being veterans of the U.S.-Mexican War. And Francis Calvin Boggs, who's in the center here, he's one of these men. Boggs comes from a very long military tradition. His family, some of them fought in the War of 1812. His father fought at the Second Seminole Indian War, which I actually cover I cover a little bit of the Second Seminole Indian War in my book. And he himself, he fights in the Mexican War, although he doesn't really see a lot of action. He comes in towards the tail end of the Mexican War. In 1901, he published his memoir, which is titled A Veteran of Four Wars. So he fights in the Mexican War, the Cuban expeditions. He then fights in the Third Seminole Indian War, and then he fights in the Civil War as well. At this point, though, in the 1850s, he's actually working as an overseer in Alabama, and he hears from a friend of his that somebody's starting up an army to go to Cuba on this expedition in New Orleans. And so he and a friend of his They actually make their way to New Orleans. They go to the St. Charles Hotel. This is sort of the epicenter of the planning. This is where a lot of these men are gathering to sign up. There's a recruiting station at the St. Charles Hotel. And he enlists in a regiment, a Louisiana regiment for this. There's going to wind up being about several hundred men on this expedition, and then also on the other expedition that happens in 1851, which I guess you figured out that the 1850 expedition probably doesn't go super well. It does not. We will get to that here in a minute. So he is very much this type of person that Lopez wants to recruit. Is either somebody that served in the Mexican War, that has military experience, that has interest in doing this type of work, but he's also interested in recruiting people who maybe missed out on the Mexican War, who are too young or didn't serve, but want to serve on kind of like the next big conquest, which is Cuba. And he pretty consistently frames these expeditions against the backdrop of the Mexican War. A lot about these expeditions is framed against that backdrop. And so when people think about the war, when people write about the war, this is like, or when they write about the expeditions, they think about the Mexican War and they write about the Mexican War as well. And so, Lopez, when he talks about the expedition and what the expedition is going to do, he says things like the filibusters are, so he referred to the filibusters as the men of the field of Palo Alto and Churubusco, which are battles in the Mexican War, and assured these, those that were not veterans of the war that they would that they were the, quote, brethren and worthy peers of the men of those immortal victories. And, Lopez goes on to emphasize that, they are going to be just as spectacular and just as successful as these Mexican War veterans. And even when he's trying to get this guy involved, whose name is John Quitman. John Quitman was actually governor of Mississippi. He goes and meets with Quitman, and he's trying to get Quitman to be involved in the war, and he's promising Quitman all different kinds of things. He promises Quitman that he might even be potentially, somebody that rules over Cuba in the aftermath of this expedition. And Quitman himself is very much an advocate of empire. He's very much an advocate of annexation and, gaining Latin American territory. He served in the Mexican War as well. So when he writes to his former aide-de-camp about this possibility of going on this expedition, he says, "Your old commander is invited to become the liberator of a beautiful and rich island in the Gulf." Later, he sort of confesses that one of the reasons that he's really interested in going is because he, wants to, recapture the sort of free air of the camp, right, the military camp. And he views himself very much as like a soldier. So he wants to kind of recapture that. And the possibility of being like prime minister of Cuba is not necessarily bad either for him. Eventually, though, he does not become involved. He doesn't actually go on the expedition. He will attempt his own expedition later, but he does not go on this one. He does put Lopez in contact with people who are going to help fund the expedition and further help plan it and are involved in it. So this is a picture painting of kind of the first expedition. And the first expedition lands at Cardenas on May 19th, 1850. This is what you see in the picture is this event. Lopez went ashore with 3 regiments, one from Louisiana, one from Kentucky, and one from Mississippi. As they marched toward the city center, they encountered a Spanish sentinel, and then a skirmish quickly took place. And many of the men, though, quickly after this skirmish, they sort of escape and they make it back to the ship that brought them there. And then they start to sail back across the Florida Straits. But the Spanish actually pursue them for a time. Lopez disbanded the remainder of the expedition before they arrived in Key West. So once they get to Key West, they're not only they're not only just having been chased by the Spanish, but they're now being chased by the U.S. Navy and U.S. naval agents. So Key West citizens actually hide some of these guys to keep them out of the hands of naval agents. Lopez himself is eventually arrested, and he is put on trial for the violation of the U.S. neutrality acts or neutrality laws with Spain. He's put on trial, and actually John Quitman is also put on trial for possible involvement in the expedition. Quitman eventually, his charges against him are dropped, but he does have to surrender, or he does have to resign from being Mississippi governor, and it's quite a scandal. Lopez, when he goes on trial in New Orleans, the federal court eventually acquits Lopez, and he immediately begins planning for yet another expedition in 1851. The 1851 expedition goes even worse than the 1850 expedition. People, while he's planning that second expedition, people are very much still attracted to it. You still have hundreds of men who are bound and determined to go on these expeditions, and they do. And so the second expedition, what winds up happening is that they're hoping to engage with and connect with an uprising on the island of Cuba. But that uprising, which is supposed to have happened July 3rd, sort of fizzles out before they get there. So there really isn't an uprising for them to meet up with. And so they're very much sort of all alone on the island, and once again fighting off Spanish troops. During one of the final battles between the Spanish troops and the filibusters, the Spanish took 51 members of the filibustering expedition prisoner, including Lopez. And one of the more well-known figures, whose name is William Crittenden, he was actually the son of the Secretary of State, John Crittenden. He was also captured. And they are then transported to Havana, where they are eventually executed. The vast majority of them are executed by firing squad. The Spanish use a particularly gruesome method to execute Lopez. So this is a drawing of this whole sort of debacle around this expedition. And the figure I want to, draw your attention to is at the top. This is actually Lopez himself. They sit him in this metal chair and they garrote him. That's what this sort of shadowy figure here in the back is doing. They put a metal strap around his neck and begin to tighten it until he chokes to death. And that's the end of Lopez himself. The reaction to this end of the expedition in 1851, Southerners react quite viscerally, but no part of the South and no part of the country really reacts quite the way that those in New Orleans react. There is an outright riot in New Orleans, but not just New Orleans. There's also a violent reaction that happens in Mobile and then also in Galveston. So people were very, very invested in this, and the riot itself begins on I think you call it Exchange Place now, but it was called Exchange Alley, just below Conti, or just near Conti Street. That's the site of the Spanish language newspaper La Unión. So August 21st, 1851, New Orleanians gathered in the streets. They marched to the offices of the Spanish language newspaper. They then proceed to storm the newspaper's printing room. They destroy presses. They throw all of the metal key type into the streets. The crowd then goes to the Spanish consulate. They tear down the Spanish flag and the sign from the consulate and then proceed to burn them. They then continue to march through the streets, arriving in the neighborhood where there are many Spanish and Cuban businesses, such as cigar shops and coffee houses, and they begin to destroy those. The New Orleans Picayune states in the aftermath that they focus primarily on Spanish businesses, but there's no way to really tell exactly. They may have also destroyed Cuban businesses, but the Picayune stresses that they didn't. that they didn't destroy Cuban businesses. Ultimately, what happens is, in the aftermath of this, is that the United States does actually try to buy Cuba in 1854. But by the time we're in 1854, the United States is not really, Americans sort of outside of the South are not really that interested. We're just at the beginning point of all of the controversy that's going to happen around Kansas and the attempt to make Kansas a state. And then that's one of those steps that leads us down the road to the Civil War. As for Lopez himself, he actually is essentially made a martyr to the cause of Cuban annexation. Several years after his death, there are people who observe his death in lots of parts of the Gulf South. There are meetings that are held to honor Lopez, who they reimagine as a sort of George Washington of Cuba. And those also happen in places like Galveston, Texas as well. And just to sort of skip ahead to the end of all of this and the end of Southern Empire, to my mind and in my book, it really ends with the end of the Confederacy, this dream of a Southern slave empire. And of course, New Orleans is very much at the center of that story as well. There are mass numbers of refugees that filter throughout the city and that filter throughout Louisiana and Texas and other parts of the Gulf South. There are also contraband camps in which African Americans are also present. So it continues to be very much a part of this story of would-be Southern Empire in the Gulf South. And this statement here, which happens right around the time of the surrender at Appomattox, is by a Texan judge who had fled Texas. He's a Unionist, fled Texas, wound up in New Orleans. And this is what he writes, that after the end of the Civil War, this renders it certain that the great Confederacy, which was Southern Confederacy, which was to have been the mistress of the world through the aid of slavery and King Cotton, is no more. One of the final ways that New Orleans is a part of this story, and that this story sort of plays out in the Gulf of Mexico, is with Confederate expats leaving the South and heading into Latin America. Of all of the people who fantasized about Latin America, Confederates fleeing the end of the Civil War are the ones who actually go there. And they don't go as conquerors, though. They go as refugees. They go as people who are terrified of the outcome of Reconstruction. So by the turn of the century, Southerners may not have spread their slave-based society out beyond the borders of the United States, but the racist visions that they had created about Latin American nations, which I didn't talk as much about now, but we can certainly talk about in the Q&A, those ideas, and then the ideas of empire, the ideas of conquest, war, and annexation, those actually stick around. They remain and become a part of the United States imperialist goals well into the 21st century. Gulf South communities continue to be a part of this story of empire and to be shaped as ever by the wars waged in its name. So thank you all very much.
All right, and I want to thank you very much. Let's see here. Let me just adjust the spotlight. All right. No, I want to thank you very much. That was certainly really interesting. You touched on a couple of different topics that I think are going to be interesting to everybody. And I'm sure we have some questions germinating in the audience. I just wanted to say, to wrap up as we get ready for the Q&A, I'm really interested in a couple of these different topics that you touched on.
Yeah.
Talking about like how we get into things, like I feel that I have, me personally, a very Gulf Coast identity myself.
Yeah.
From New Orleans, but I went to high school and college in Texas. I spent a lot of time in Galveston. So, these are some of my waypoints. And then I also got, really, I'm more interested, me personally, I'm more interested in Reconstruction.
Right,
but
yeah.
kind of time period. And I wanted to say, you can't for those in the audience that are just, who came to this because they're mostly into like Louisiana history and New Orleans history, you probably already know you can't study New Orleans without also studying Cuba, Haiti,
Mhm.
and places like Veracruz and our connections to Venezuela as well, because they're so important. Uh,
Absolutely.
and then I just wanted to circle back, like really quick, to something you brought up in your introduction that was like kind of important for keeping in mind when you got into filibustering and things like that. Was this kind of like, I want to call it like a south-facing version of Manifest Destiny?
Yeah.
Um, and it's not something, well, and for if anybody didn't understand what I meant by that, like, but like this Western and also Southern drive to try to
Hmm.
take over territory, but with the Southern perspective for the expansion of slavery. Such a huge, important part of our national story, but it's a concept that's not discussed when we discuss our national story. When you read
Yeah.
U.S. history, you learn the mid, like what I want to call like the Midwest manifest destiny with the Oregon
Yeah.
Trail and things like that. You don't learn about these filibustering expeditions to Cuba, the Mexican War, the Mexican American War is like usually like kind of a blip, but like
Hmm.
that was a huge expansion. We took half of Mexico's territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, which is wild. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so thank you very much. I wanted to kick it up to questions coming in from the audience. If you're in the audience, you can still type your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand. We'll call on you. I have some questions as well, but the very first one, why did so many men sign up for these expeditions? What was in it for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's probably a couple different things. I think that one of the reasons that a lot of men sign up it has to do with ideas about masculinity in the 19th century, with the idea that one of the ways that you sort of prove your masculinity, especially if you're a younger man, is through war, through martial practice. And for a lot of the men who were involved, who weren't veterans of the Mexican War, this is one way to do that. And you can also see that to a certain, you can actually see that to not just a certain extent, but quite a lot in the Civil War. A lot of young men are driven to be a part of the Civil War because it's a way for them to prove their manhood, for a way for them to become men. I think that that's one reason. I also think that, in terms of veterans of the Mexican War, for some of them, like John Quitman, it's a way to kind of recapture the glory of the battlefield and to kind of do it all over again. For them, the Mexican War was something that was exciting. It was something that was, an adventure, and they are oftentimes referred to as adventurers. So that's kind of how they're framing this. For men like Francis Boggs, he's kind of in that sort of middling space. I wouldn't say that he's middle class exactly, in sort of Alabama and in Southern society, but being an overseer, he's sort of like getting there. And so there it might be a possibility of monetary advantage, moving up in the world. That's how westward expansion is also framed. People go out west to make it rich. They go out west to buy property when they can't buy property in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi. And they're kind of thinking about Cuba that same way. And Lopez is very much feeding into that. He talks about the fact that you're going to be successful in Cuba and you're going to get land and everything's going to be great. And so those are the sort of reasons that men decide to go on these expeditions.
That's good. And then our next question comes from Elaine. Raise your hand. I was going to ask Elaine to unmute or type your question in the chat.
Hi.
Hi.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for this talk. I cannot wait to read the book. Congratulations. So I actually have two questions. And one, as you were talking, I really tried to keep that map that you showed us in the front of my mind. And so my question is about the sea, the Gulf of Mexico, the sea, which took up, sort of the biggest part.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, this was a really fearsome place. Explorers would write about the Gulf of Mexico as a whirlpool, that would
Yeah.
swallow them whole. De Brahms thought it was sort of leaching away at the state of Florida, that Florida was dissolving, right? Like into the Gulf Stream. And in the 19th century, it's not as sinister, but it's quite a scary place. There are new nautical charts around navigating the fierce northers, these the northers that cut across Texas into the Gulf of Mexico, blow a lot of ships off course. And so my question is how the sea itself, the material conditions of the sea features in a lot of the stories that you're telling, which do involve, just from, the people you're talking about, quite a lot of crisscrossing of this space in, sort of seemingly fragile kind of wooden ships.
Yeah.
And then my next question, I just find these Confederate colonies so fascinating.
They are, yes.
And so my question on that topic is simply, you brought up an interest in kind of encounters and spaces, these sort of shared spaces between seemingly diametrically opposed sets of people. And so what were those encounters? What have you found about the encounters these colonies, members of these colonies, had with the people who were already living there?
Right, yeah.
And so, I just had a follow-up question about that as well, but really interesting stuff. Thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Thanks. Okay, so to your first question, the thing that you bring up makes me think about I've read a lot of journals and letters and everything when I was doing this research, and travel logs or travel narratives as well. And in all of them, they always have this moment where they reach the Gulf of Mexico and they see it for the first time. And that's always recorded. And beyond that, the second thing that's always recorded is whenever they encounter a storm, right? And so that is very, that idea of the Gulf of Mexico as a dangerous place, as a possibly even treacherous space, environmentally, that is very present in how they view that space. But I think it also is part of what is driving communities along the Gulf South to try and control it in the 19th century. They don't just want to control it in terms of trade, but they want to learn how to master it and control it in terms of the sea itself. And I think that feeds into this, martial naval drive that a lot of these communities have. I actually think they're very much connected. This fear of being conquered by some outside enemy, I think, is connected to the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is very dangerous because of those storms and hurricanes and that unpredictability. I think that it all feeds into this, quite frankly, this paranoia that a lot of these communities have. When I first did a talk on Florida, actually, somebody asked me in the crowd, I remember, and this was years and years ago, why are they so militaristic? And I'm like, because they're on the edge. They're right there on the edge with all of this unpredictability in terms of other races, other nation states, other empires, but also, at any moment, there could be a massive hurricane that wipes you off the face of the map. And so, that drives them to want to have an army presence and a naval presence. And naval presence doesn't just mean, fending off other naval empires, but it means exploration. It means scientific study of the Gulf South as well. So I think that's, yeah, absolutely. People are feeding on that unpredictability of the Gulf Coast. The second thing, oh man, so Confederados and what I call Confederate expats, man, this is like a whole other thing. So I talk about this it's the very last chapter of my book. And I look at two different sort of groups. So there's lots of different colonies, but those colonies are focused in Mexico and then Brazil. I think there's some in Honduras. And then there are some who go to Cuba. But really, when Confederates flee the South, they go all over the place. Some of them actually go up north. Some of them actually wind up in Europe. I think some of them wind up as far away as Egypt. And there are very much, you know, those people that don't think that the upper echelon of the Confederacy did not commit treason, but that may be a prevalent thought amongst lost causers. But the reality is that they knew they had committed treason and that they were worried about what was going to happen to them. And so a lot of them beat it for the border. And so I study I studied the first group that goes to Mexico, which is a lot of, I look at the movement of Confederate officers through Texas and into Mexico. And then I also look at a much later group that go to Brazil, which are the Confederados. They do form communities. Those actually last longer than the ones in Mexico as actual colonies. And how people, so in Brazil, and also to a certain extent in Mexico, but in Brazil, many of the people who are going to Brazil are really trading on the idea that Southerners are very much connected with cotton production and the fact that they are very successful at producing cotton, right? They know how to make cotton pay. And they kind of trade off of that reputation in order to get favors, in order to get cheap land from like the emperor in Brazil. In Mexico, many of those soldiers go and many of those officers wind up wanting to participate in the war that's happening there. I didn't touch on that, but there is a war happening in Mexico at the same time as the Civil War, which is a French invasion of Mexico. And they wind up going to, you know, pledge their loyalty, and they want to pledge their loyalty to the emperor that has been installed in Mexico. And it's through working with him that they're able to found these colonies. But they're never as successful as they were in the South. They don't become big time planters. They don't become any of the fantasies that they had before the war. That doesn't really manifest them. You know, that doesn't really manifest itself in the aftermath of the Civil War. You know, so and a lot of the ones that go to Brazil wind up coming back because, you know, Brazil, it's so foreign to them. And, you know, and there are those that go to Mexico and they also come back as well, especially once they realize that you know, they're not going to be hanged. And, you know, they'll be relatively safe if they go back home. So, yeah, it's in terms of how, like, on the ground Mexicans or, you know, Brazilian people around those communities feel, I didn't get a sense of that in my research, but I just sort of, because it's one chapter, I did like a toe dip into this research, but that's definitely a question I would be interested in pursuing. Thank you.
Yeah, those are both really interesting. Yeah, and me personally, I'm very fascinated in these people who I in my mind I always call it self-imposed exile.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely what they are.
A lot of them, you know, found out that they were eligible for pardons once they finally got settled, and it's like, well, I'll just go back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a similar question to follow up on what we're talking about on, you know, why men would sign up for these filibustering expeditions, because you know, you mentioned that, you know, through, well, even the ones that we might consider filibustering, or like like, so West Florida Republic, the Texas Revolution, then the Mexican-American War, and the Lopez expeditions. It's mostly Southern white men that are volunteering, and then like disproportionately representing Mississippi.
It's a fair number of them,
yeah. So obviously, like this like you mentioned this earlier, that like this kind of involvement becomes like a major cultural touchstone in Southern white culture. So my question is, so two-part, how did white Northerners view all of this? And then if you know, like, I'd be fascinated about it, Hispanic people in Texas in the far West, what did they think about these filibustering expeditions?
Yeah, so to the first one, the expeditions are actually, like, I focus on the South, and a lot of people do, perhaps to, you know, a little bit too much, because, you know, in reality, these expeditions were, you know, Americans were fascinated with this. And what's funny is that they're illegal, like they're completely not governmentally sanctioned, but and they're the worst kept secret in the United States. Like everybody knows where you go to sign up for the expeditions. And so, Americans are very fascinated by them. I'm sorry. So what was your question? Was it about the South? I'm sorry, I got off track.
No. Yeah. So just other Americans besides
Oh yeah, okay.
besides white Southerners. So
Right. So, if you read other historians who do study this stuff, there are those that are very heavily critical, obviously, of these expeditions because they are not governmentally sanctioned. Did these people even ask us to come and do this? There's a lot of debate about that. Lopez, at least in the second expedition, does maintain that they want them to come, but yes and no, kind of. And so I think that there's much more people who disapprove of these expeditions outside of the South, and you're going to find it in the South. So that said, Americans are still, in general, interested in Cuba. But by the time we get to 54 and this other attempt to purchase it, which is called the Ostend Manifesto, is what that is. It's by these diplomats who then, want to try to buy it. And that is a legally sanctioned thing. Spain is like, no, you just had these crazy weirdos like come and storm the island. Like, we're not going to sell you this. And also it's making a lot of money. We're not going to sell you this island. But, Americans are like, there's all this buildup around Kansas and Nebraska now. And there's all of this continued anti-slavery, abolitionist efforts to really criticize this stuff. And abolitionists do criticize. They criticize the Mexican War. They criticize, Texas as just a Southern land grab. So there is those rising tensions in the United States that kind of pull the United States away from, writ large, this, this fantasy to buy or to take over Cuba. But filibusters still continue. They continue all the way into, towards the Civil War. How, say, Mexicans and, people of Latin American descent or Mexican descent in the West feel about it. I think that they're pretty hostile towards it. I mean, certainly Mexicans, when it comes to Texas, Mexicans and the Mexican government are very aware of what it is that the United States or what it is that Americans are interested in doing or attempting to do. They're very aware of the United States having this expansionist reputation, and they're hostile towards it. They don't like that. They're very nervous about it. And, it's kind of interesting because that relationship goes from like the 1820s when the United States is like, yay, sister republics, to the 1840s when the United States is like, let's take over all this land. That relationship begins to be sour. It's not that great. And, but then at the same time, push forward into the French intervention and it's a different story. Mexico is interested in some kind of support. And the United States is interested in fending off the French. So, that relationship is constantly back and forth throughout its existence. And the Civil War era is no different.
That's the perfect segue to my next question, which I was going to ask for the benefit of our audience. And I'm going to try and shrink it down because when you hear it, it's going to sound really big. But the Monroe Doctrine,
yeah,
which, selectively enforced definition, but could you just speak about I guess the duality of the existence of the Monroe Doctrine in American policy and the tacit support of filibustering expeditions? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that for the filibusters, weirdly, they don't really rely on the Monroe Doctrine too much. Where you really see the Monroe Doctrine come into play is in the sort of later end of the 19th century when we're talking about American imperialist interests. And it does, I think, to a certain extent come into play with the French intervention. But for filibusters, because this is not legally sanctioned, they kind of decide they're going to go and do it. And once Cuba is independent and the United States can annex it, all will be forgiven, is their kind of vibe. And, you know, certainly even the expeditions to Nicaragua by William Walker, which happened later in the 1850s, that's sort of the same kind of a thing. It's like, you know, we're going to take this over and then America will love us for it. Sort of how they feel. What is it that it's better to apologize afterwards and ask for permission?
Yeah, forgiveness than permission.
Yes.
Trying to adapt that. I mean, I'm trying to adopt that ethos myself, but I'm not going to do anything like William Walker. Yes, no, these are all like really fascinating topics. I wanted to pause for a moment because I had my list of my own questions. I wanted to pause to make sure I wasn't leaving anyone out in the audience who was sitting on a question. If you have one, if you are too shy to raise your hand, type it into the chat. Otherwise, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. Do we have a question from Christopher? It's okay if you did, and I wasn't trying to call you out. All right. Well, while we wait for any other questions to come in, I just wanted to thank you again. He was just saying he liked it. Sorry for the confusion there. No, these are really, I mean, there's a lot of interesting topics here. I wanted to thank you for bringing forward the Lopez expeditions part. This is a really great New Orleans connection. But I'm sure there's a lot of other interesting things in the book. I know that I'm interested in following those, you know, Confederates.
I think there was a question here. How are these filibuster expeditions today viewed in Cuba? That I don't 100% know. But I do, one of the things that I forgot to mention is that the modern day flag of Cuba is actually, does come from the Lopez expeditions. Lopez is one of the people that helped to design that flag. It wasn't just him, it was another person that was involved. But it does come from those expeditions, from Lopez. I think that probably because it is an example of, even though Lopez himself is Venezuelan, spent time in Cuba, I think that because the expeditions involve a lot of Americans, it's trying to take over Cuba. It's probably not super well celebrated or viewed as wholly positive in modern day Cuba. But you know, there is that connection to modern day Cuba as the flag.
That's wild. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yep.
Well, I'm out of my questions. So I did want to say thank you again. We're going to pause for a moment to make sure we don't have any more questions coming in from the audience. But thank you for your time and thank you for sharing this with us. A reminder that the book is out through the University of Georgia Press. Order it through their website. You can ask for it at your favorite local bookstore. And without
Thank you.
Any other questions coming in? Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you very much to our speaker tonight, Dr. Diaz. The recording will go out tomorrow morning. And if you know anybody who was not able to attend tonight and wants the recording, just reach out to me. But otherwise, thank you everyone. And thank you, Dr. Diaz, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. This was great. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.